day, and we'll be grateful to give you honor and praise and thanks for it. And in all these things, we come before you in the strong name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And let's all say together, amen. Amen. Let's send these students and leaders off as they serve. All right. So it was a special day to commission God's servants to do his work. Special day for dads, special day for praying for our world. It's also a special day because we are kicking off a new summer series today. This one started several months ago. I was taking a walk with my older daughter, and we were talking about a couple of friends of hers who just recently started coming to church. And that's a great thing, and it's been fun to have them with us. And so she's been having these conversations, and the topic came up of some of the Bible stories that my daughter and other kids heard growing up. You know, it was the bedtime stories that we read to them from kids' story books. It was the stories they got in Sunday school and in church. And we got to, oh, hello, back. We got to talking about what if we talked about this at church? What if we did a sermon series where we talked about some of the classic Bible stories in case you missed it? So if that's you, maybe you've come to faith or are exploring Christianity as an adult, and maybe some of the stories that are familiar to those who grew up in church, maybe they're new to you. So in case you missed it, we're going to count down the top 10 of these Bible stories over the next 10 weeks here this summer. And of course, if you did grow up hearing these stories or have picked them up along the way, and you go back and read them, it's kind of like watching a show or a movie that you remember as a kid, and then you see it as an adult, and you're like, oh my goodness, I don't remember that, or that, or that. And in fact, the whole thing isn't at all what I thought it was when I was a kid. So in case you missed it, we're going to go back and we're going to see some of the details and themes that emerge in these stories. So I don't know how many stories there are total in the Bible. I haven't counted. You could probably Google it, but it would be, in the hundreds, if not thousands. How do you get a top 10, and who's to say what the top 10 are? So we had a fun little, game this past spring where Janelle, our kids minister, went to the kids. We did a bracket during March Madness and narrowed it down to the top 10 Bible stories for a life of faith, according to the kids of Lake Norman Baptist, with a few asterisks. We're not including Christmas and Easter, because we figure you didn't miss those. We're also not including stories from the book of Daniel, because I just preached from the book of Daniel in the fall. So all the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the Daniel and the lion's den, great stories. But if you want to hear about those, go online, find the sermons from our dual citizenship series, and you can catch up on those there. So with some modifications, a few asterisks along the way, we're going to count down the top 10 Bible stories for a life of faith, starting now with number 10. And let's check this out.
In case you missed it, we're going to tell you all about it.
Do you know the story of Joshua and the Battle of Jericho?
Yes.
You do? Okay.
Joshua was the new leader, and they were going to the promised land, but then they saw Jericho and they're scared, so God gave them a punishment because they didn't believe, and they had to walk in the desert for 40 years and 40 nights.
So the Israelites have almost reached the end of the desert where there is grass, but there's only one problem: Jericho.
They walked around the city of Jericho and they got all the musicians.
Were they playing instruments?
Yeah. The people walking around the building blowing trumpets. Just doing. And then they had to march around the Tower of Jericho for 7 days. And then when Joshua said, now, and the wall fell apart.
All right, so our resident scholars have spoken. Top 10 in our top 10 list is Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. In case you missed it, there's some good stuff in this story for us to learn. This is a story about God's promises. It's a story about God's plans. It's also a story about God's justice and God's mercy. So let's dig into this story today and see what we might have missed from the story of Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. And the first thing we want to see, in case you missed it, we can believe God's promises, even if they take a long time. We can believe God's promises, even if they take a long time. Now, we see this in the story, in the backstory, the history of how we came to this place where Joshua and the people of Israel were at the city called Jericho. So we're going to put a map up on the screen, and we're going to see, because this story began not when they marched up against these walls, but many generations before. In fact, 600-700 years before, God came to Abraham, who was in the Ur of the Chaldees, so he's off the map, and he called him to a place called Canaan, which is that number 5 right up there in the top right. And that was the land that God had said to Abraham, look around, Abraham. I'm going to give your generation, your people, your descendants, not his generation, but his descendants, this land. At that time, there were lots of other nations occupying it. The Canaanites, the Amorites, the Jebusites, and it lists all those. But God made a promise to Abraham hundreds of years before the Jericho event that that land would be theirs. So Abraham had his son Isaac, then they had Jacob. During the time of Jacob, there was a famine in Canaan, and so they fled to Egypt. And that's where they escaped the famine that was in the land of Canaan. And then they were in Egypt for 430 years. They became enslaved to the Egyptians. And then, as per God's promise to Abraham, God came and spoke to Moses to lead them out. When it was time to fulfill his promise of the promised land, God led the people out of Egypt under Moses' leadership across the Red Sea. And you can see that down there on the bottom left. And then for 40 years, they wandered around in the wilderness. And you can see the path that one scholar mapped out for us that they may have taken through the wilderness. And then they found themselves up at the Jordan River, where that number 4 circle is. And Jericho is just to the west of the Jordan River. So kind of right above where that number 5 is. That's where Jericho was. And at the opening of the book of Joshua, the people find themselves, after 40 years wandering around in the desert, after 430 years in Egypt, God is about to fulfill the promise that he had made to their ancestor, Abraham. And that's the opening of the book of Joshua. That gets us from Genesis 12, when God spoke to Abraham, all the way through the book of Deuteronomy. Now, the whole book of Deuteronomy is Moses' speech there at the Jordan River. For disobedience to God along the way, Moses was actually prevented from entering the promised land. And so Moses is giving his final instructions in the whole book of Deuteronomy on the east bank of the Jordan River. And then the book of Joshua opens up with the baton being passed from Moses as the great leader of Israel to Joshua as the new leader of Israel. And then the first 5 chapters in Joshua are the preparations that take place for the Battle of Jericho. The Battle of Jericho comes in Joshua chapter 6. But before we get there, there's some important details that actually help make sense of the Battle of Jericho. The first is this. In Joshua chapter 1, we have the official passing of the baton to Joshua, and we have the commissioning of the Lord to him. Now, much like we prayed for these students and leaders to be commissioned to go out and do the work of the Lord, Joshua 1 is Joshua's commission from God to be the leader of Israel as he would fulfill his promise and give them the promised land. And he gave a message 3 times to Joshua that stands out, and it becomes the great theme, not only of Joshua's life, but throughout the story of the conquest of the promised land. Joshua got this commission from God. In Joshua 1:6, he said to him, "Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them." So there it is. God says to Joshua, be strong and courageous, because after all these generations, after all these years, you're going to be the one to lead the people into the land that I have promised. Can you imagine that? You imagine being Joshua and you get that word from the Lord? His whole life and for generations, 600-700 years, maybe more, they've been waiting for this promise. And God says, you're the one, Joshua. You're the one that's going to lead them in. And then to reinforce that message, he said again to Joshua in verse 7, he said, be strong and very courageous. He strengthened his word. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. So he adds some detail to this second commissioning. He says, be strong and very courageous, and you're going to need to follow the law to a T. This is going to be very important for Joshua and the people as they move into the promised land. And then a third time, he says to Joshua in Joshua 1:9, have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. You getting the message here? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. So he gives them this message of strength and courage. You're going to be the one to lead the people to the land I promised. Be careful to obey the law as you occupy this new land. And then maybe the greatest promise of all, he says, be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid. Don't be discouraged. It's not going to be easy. But the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Hang on to that, because that's central to the lessons that we learn from all of Joshua and specifically the battle of Jericho. Be strong and courageous, for the Lord will be with you wherever you go. So Joshua 1 is a highlight chapter, right? It's inspiring. If this were the beginning of a movie, you're like, yeah, I'm ready for it. The music is playing, the people are going. And then you get into Joshua chapter 2, and the first action Joshua takes, having been commissioned as the great leader of Israel, he sends a couple of spies to presumably get in a boat, cross the Jordan River, and spy out the land. They go to Jericho, and the very first thing they do, they get to Jericho, and they go right to the house of a prostitute. Like what? Like that's what happened? With no explanation in the text for why they did this and why this is in the story. In case you missed it, that might not be what you would expect. Now, scholars who you read this, there's no explanation in the text, but it's probably not what most people would assume would be the reason for a couple of spies to go to the house of a prostitute. The best theory that I've come across is that because of her occupation, her home would be in a place that was pretty discreet. We're told it was built into the wall of Jericho, close to the entrance. And so it was probably on a dark alley out of the way where spies would be most likely not to be caught, not to be seen. Also, this is a woman who's probably pretty good at keeping secrets. So I imagine there were some strategic reasons that this was a smart move on the behalf of these spies. But clearly, the main deal is that God had ordained this, and he used this for his purposes. His unexpected detail in the story, and it's going to come back when we get to Joshua chapter 6 and the Battle of Jericho. So hang on to Rahab and her role in this story. Then in Joshua 3, they cross the Jordan River from the east side to the west side. Now, this is significant because 40 years before, when God opened the way for the Israelites to be delivered from slavery in Egypt, what happened? He parted the Red Sea, and the people walked out of Egypt on the dry ground of the Red Sea, wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and now here they are, the promise about to be fulfilled, and they cross a river, another body of water, another miraculous act of God, parting the waters for them to enter into the promised land. And that's in Joshua chapter 3. Joshua chapter 4, they erect a monument. So one man from each of the 12 tribes comes, gets a big stone. They pile them up as a stone of remembrance for what God did in parting the waters of the Jordan. And then we get to Joshua chapter 5. Now, Joshua chapter 5 is a super important chapter because of the details that we see that prepare us for what happens in Joshua chapter 6 and the Battle of Jericho. It's a chapter of consecration, of preparation for what God was going to do in and through the people of Israel. So the first thing they did was they circumcised all the men who had been born in the desert. So that was a sign among the Israelites of how they were set apart. They were to be different, right down to their core. They were different from the other nations. And then they celebrated the Passover. And this is significant because it was the time of year when the Jews celebrated the Passover. It was the 14th day of the first month of the year. Now, if you were with us a few weeks ago, as we were moving through the Lent season and preparing for the crucifixion of Jesus, Jesus celebrated the Passover with his disciples. It was the 14th day of the first month of the year when the Jews celebrated the annual Passover. What was the Passover? It was when they were delivered from Egypt on the 14th night of the first month of the year. So 40 years to the day after having been delivered out of slavery in Egypt, here they are in the land that God had promised, and they celebrate the Passover meal. What a moment in the life of Israel. But it gets better. We're told the day after the Passover, they, for the first time in 40 years, ate food that was harvested from the land. For 40 years as they wandered in the wilderness, God fed them with manna. Every single day, this bread that came down from heaven, because there was no food out in the desert, God had sustained them. But we're told the day after they celebrated the Passover in the promised land was the first time in 40 years they could harvest food from the land, and the manna stopped because they were where God had led them. And then it gets even better than that. So after they had celebrated the Passover, after they had eaten from the fruit of the land, they're getting close to Jericho, which is the first city in the land of Canaan that they came to. And this is what we're told Joshua encountered. Chapter 5, verse 13 says, "Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, 'Are you for us or for our enemies?' 'Neither,' he replied, 'but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come.' Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, 'What message does my Lord have for his servant?' The commander of the Lord's army replied, 'Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy.' And Joshua did so." Now, if that sounds familiar to you, it's because 40 plus years earlier, when God decided it was time to begin to fulfill his promise to Abraham, he met Moses in the wilderness in a burning bush, and he spoke to him, and he said to Moses, "Moses, take off your sandals, because the ground you're standing on is holy. I'm about to fulfill my promise through you." And then 40 years later, he says to Joshua, as he's coming into the promised land, "Joshua, take off your sandals, because you're in the Holy Land." That's a moment. I mean, that's a thing. He had made this promise to his ancestor hundreds of years before. And even though it took a long time, God fulfilled his promise. Which is why I say we can believe God's promises even when they take a long time. We saw in our study of Romans just recently, one of the concluding truths in Romans 8 came in verse 28. It said, God works in all things for the good of his children, of those who love him, of those who are called according to his purpose. And that's his promise. He's working in all things for the good of his children. Sometimes it takes a while. But there's a popular worship song going around right now. You may have heard it. It says, if it's not good, then God's not done. It's an encourager that God is still at work. But sometimes we have to wait a long time. And sometimes in the waiting, we start to wonder if we can believe God's promises. If you talk to my wife, Dina, about a circumstance in her life where she waited a long time, where we as a family waited a long time, she would tell you the story of her brother. When they were young, their mother passed, and it was that circumstance that brought my wife, Dina, to a serious faith. But sadly, her brother, that was the beginning of his story of alcoholism. And for 24 years, he battled alcoholism. And for 24 years, Dina prayed for her brother. Our family prayed for her brother. when our kids were young, every Tuesday, we would pray for their uncle, that God would deliver him, that God would save him, that God would meet him. 3 years ago, in 2022, God saved him. It wasn't with great pomp and circumstance, but he drew him to church, and it was enough. He had come to a place where he needed to change. He went to church looking for God, and God met him there. And for 3 years, he's been sober. He's following after Jesus. He's been commissioned in his church to go and do missions projects. God saved him, but it took a long time. And I wonder what you might be waiting for in your life. What have you been waiting for? But it's been a long time. In case you missed it, we can believe God's promises, even if they take a long time. What was about to happen for the people of Israel, for Joshua, was something that they had waited for literally 700 years. And God was now fulfilling it. Which leads us to the second great truth. In case you missed it, we can trust God's plans, even if they seem strange. And this leads us to the story of the Battle of Jericho in Joshua chapter 6. We're going to read the first 16 verses, and you'll see our kids did a pretty good job of telling this story. Joshua 6, beginning of verse 1, says this. Now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out, and no one came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry the trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse, and the army will go up, everyone straight in." So Joshua, the son of Nun, called the priests and said to him, "Take up the ark of the covenant of the Lord and have 7 priests carry trumpets in front of it." And he ordered the army, "Advance, march around the city with an armed guard going ahead of the ark of the Lord." When Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets before the Lord went forward, blowing their trumpets, and the ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. The armed guard marched ahead of the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard followed the ark. All this time the trumpets were sounding. But Joshua had commanded the army, "Do not give a war cry, do not raise your voices, do not say a word until the day I tell you to shout. Then shout." So he had the ark of the Lord carried around the city, circling it once. Then the army returned to camp and spent the night there. Joshua got up early the next morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. The 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets went forward, marching before the ark of the Lord and blowing the trumpets. The armed men went ahead of them, and the rear guard followed the ark of the Lord while the trumpets kept sounding. So on the 2nd day, they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. On the 7th day, they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except that on that day, they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priests sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." And then down in verse 20 we see, when the trumpets shouted, the army shouted. When the trumpet sounded, the army shouted. And at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. I love how one of our kids put it. Joshua said, "Now!" And the walls came tumbling down. And so goes the story of Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. But if you didn't know the story ahead of time, you got to admit, that plan was a little bit strange, wasn't it? Not exactly what you would think of in terms of a battle that you would draw up a battle plan for an army to take a city. But what we see in this is that we can trust God's plans even when they seem strange. And so there are 5 reasons that I want to point out that come from this plan, like 5 reasons for this battle plan that God put in front of his people. And I got most of these from a scholar that has long since passed. His name is Matthew Henry, and he's one of the few Bible scholars who wrote a commentary on the whole Bible. So a commentary is an academic text where a Bible scholar is writing about either a section of Scripture or a book of the Bible or a section of the Bible to help us understand its context and its interpretation and its meaning and all these things. And so there's lots of them when you're studying the Bible, and lots of scholars who've written on different parts of the Bible, and then a few who've written on the whole Bible. Matthew Henry is one of these, and I mentioned him because what's also unique about his commentary is that it's in the public domain. So you can Google Matthew Henry's commentary and get some explanation of anything in the Bible, and it's just helpful. There are other commentaries that go deeper and are more academic in different ways, but his is always insightful and helpful. And I share that because if you're interested in going deeper with these stories or other stories in the Bible, other sections of the Bible, that's a helpful resource. You can look that up, and it helps you make some sense of what's happening in the context behind some of these stories. A lot of things you might miss is helpful to read. So several things from Matthew Henry that help us see the reasons behind this seemingly strange plan of God. First reason is this: to make clear it was God's power, not theirs, not the Israelites, that would claim the promised land. This strange plan made it clear that it was God's power at work. And God is clearly the main character in this story. Not only because the whole Bible is about God, but specifically in this narrative, he's the one who opens the story with this speech where he gives Joshua the instructions for what's going to happen. When you're reading a story in the Bible, the ones who speak the most tend to be the most prominent characters. And in this case, it's God himself. Also in the text, another clue that God is the main agent of action here is the presence of the number 7. Notice that in the story over and over and over again. The 7 priests who blew the 7 trumpets, they marched around the city for 7 days, and they did 7 laps on the 7th day. Throughout the Bible, when you see the number 7, it's a sign of God's presence and God's work. You could think of the 7 days of creation. In the tabernacle where the people worshiped God, there were 7 lamps and 7 lampstands symbolizing God's presence among the people. When you get to the book of Revelation, there's the 7 spirits and the 7 churches. So the complete work of God and the presence of God is indicated by this number 7. And it shows up again and again and again in the story, reminding us that in and through all these details, it's God's power at work. Which leads to a second reason for this seemingly strange plan, and that is to emphasize the need for God's presence among his people. Not only his power to be at work, but his presence with the people. And the presence of God in the Old Testament was symbolized in the Ark of the Covenant. And so the priests were carrying this ark, and they were blowing the trumpets, and it symbolized that God's presence was there in the midst of his people. You had the army out front, you had the priests, you had the Ark of the Covenant, and then you had the rear guard of the army behind it. So in the center, God was keeping his promise that he said to Joshua in Joshua 1:9, I will be with you wherever you go. And so as we read this story and we see the Ark of the Covenant, we're reminded of the need for God's presence, the importance of God's presence among his people. A third reason for this strange plan of God, this strange battle plan, and it's to show that this was spiritual warfare, not just physical. This battle that they were about to engage in, yes, it was physical. Yes, there were literal physical walls and a literal physical city with a literal physical army that was mightier and more powerful than the Israelites. And this isn't the only city. There's a whole bunch of them that are more powerful than Israel. But what we see in this plan is that this battle was a spiritual battle primarily, not just a physical one. And we see that in the presence of the priests. Like in a typical battle plan, who expects the preachers to get sent out in the middle of the army? Nobody's sending the priests or the preachers out to be in the army. That probably wouldn't go very well. But yet they have this central role in the story. And it shows the spiritual nature of this battle. And in fact, God had prepared them for this in the instructions that he gave to Moses in the wilderness. In Numbers 10, verses 8 and 9, we see this, God speaking through Moses about what was going to happen when they entered the promised land. It said, the sons of Aaron, the priests, are to blow the trumpets. This is to be a lasting ordinance for you and the generations to come. When you go into battle in your own land against an enemy who is oppressing you, sound a blast on the trumpets. Then you will be remembered by the Lord your God and rescued from your enemies. So the fact that the priests were central to this procession signals the fact that this is a spiritual battle that the Lord is engaging his people in, and he's going to be the one, through his presence and power, to engage his enemies in battle. A fourth reason for this strange battle plan of God, and this is the one that probably jumps out at us the most. It was to test the faith of the people in waiting and trusting God. I mean, this would be a test of anybody's faith, right? They crossed the Jordan. That was a miracle. God got us through those 40 years. Unbelievable. Here we finally are. And now for 7 days, the instruction to the army was wait. And not just to wait, but you notice the detail to wait in silence. And these are soldiers, like trained soldiers. They're ready for this battle. They've prepared their whole life for this moment. And the message that Joshua gave them was, the priests are going to blow the trumpets, and you just be quiet. Don't give a shout. In fact, Joshua said, don't even say a word. Imagine that. This is the army. Shh. Wait. For 7 days. And they had to test their faith. And it calls to mind what David said in Psalm 62. He said, my soul, wait in silence for God alone, for my hope is in him. It also recalls the message that God gave through Moses when he parted the Red Sea. He told the people, your only job is to be still and wait for what God is going to do. But they had to trust during the waiting. And you and I can easily recognize it probably wasn't the easiest thing to do. And perhaps along the way, they also had to endure some enemy taunts. Now, there's nothing in the text that would suggest this, but scholars imagine this scenario where, the king of Jericho, we're told they'd heard about the Israelites crossing the Jordan. All the rest of the nations in Canaan had heard it as well. They were terrified at this miraculous thing they'd heard about. And so that's why they shut the gates, and they were all, they were all locked up inside Jericho to protect themselves. And so you imagine the Jerichoans, whatever they were called, looking out the windows and peering over the wall, and they're seeing, oh man, here they come. Here come the army of Israel. We heard about what happened at the Jordan River, which incidentally was about 5 miles to their east. And you imagine at first they were terrified. But can you imagine the Jerichoans after they watched the Israelites march around and then go back on day one? I can imagine that might have been a little spooky, like, what is going on here? And then day 2, they do it again. Day 3, they do it again. And you can imagine by day 4, 5, 6, maybe the residents of Jericho, the army of Jericho, might have gotten a little bit more confidence and courage back and go, if this is how they're going to come at us in battle, well, we can take this. And VeggieTales picked up on this detail, and they helped us imagine it with this little clip.
What are you doing? We're going to knock your wall down. By walking around in circles? Yes. It's not because we're crazy or anything. Our God told us to do it this way.
Oh, that's a great idea. You go ahead and keep walking.
That's a great idea. You go ahead and keep walking. And those of you who grew up watching Monty Python and the Search for the Holy Grail, you recognize that they got that from there as well. My favorite line from that movie, blow my nose at you. So the harassment that might have come from the Jericho army. Perhaps the Israelites had to endure just a little bit of that as they waited and trusted. But this was, among other things, a test of their faith for sure. And it brings us to the fifth reason for this strange battle plan. And this one we know because of the conclusion of this chapter. It was to establish a new leader who would follow God's plan no matter what. God had raised up Joshua. He gave him this plan, and to a T, strange as it would have seemed, Joshua followed it. And the conclusion of this story, we're going to see in just a moment, is that it established Joshua as the new leader, and also his fame, his reputation went out ahead. As a result of this battle, not only was he established among the Israelites, this is our man, this is Moses' replacement, but the people of Canaan all throughout, they heard and they feared Joshua from that moment. So this was the raising up of a new leader, not for his own strength, not for his own wisdom, not for his own power, but because he would follow and trust God's plans no matter what. So how does this story resolve? In any great story, there's the climax. We just saw the climax of the story. The walls came tumbling down. So what's the aftermath? How does the story resolve after that? And that's the second section of Joshua chapter 6. And even in this, we can see lessons that we might have missed that we can learn. So in case you missed it, we're not just learning about God's promises or his plans. We're learning that we can rest in God's justice and mercy, even if we don't know the whole story. So here's the conclusion of the story and what we can take away from it, starting in verse 17. It said, the city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. This is Joshua speaking to the armies. He said, only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise, you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury. When the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed, so everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Joshua said to the two men who had spied out the land, go into the prostitute's house and bring her out, and all who belong to her, in accordance with your oath to her. So the young men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father and mother, her brothers and sisters, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. Then they burned the whole city and everything in it. But they put the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. At that time, Joshua pronounced this solemn oath. Cursed before the Lord is the one who undertakes to rebuild this city, Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn son, he will lay its foundations. At the cost of his youngest son, he will set up its gates. So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout the land. So this second half of the story, that's the part that doesn't usually show up in the kids' books. That's not the part that the kids remembered when they were retelling the story. And this is the part of the story that if you're reading it and you don't have the broader context, it's pretty troubling, right? They come in and the text is very specific. They killed everybody, men, women, young, old, cattle, sheep, donkeys, slaughtered them all, burned the city to the ground. And you and I might be tempted to think, oh man, like that's a little much. Like, is that really necessary, God? And this is why it's important to know how this story began. Hundreds of years before, God made this promise to Abraham that his descendants were going to occupy this land when the time was right. And when the time was right was when it was time in God's righteous justice to deal with the evil and wickedness in that land. For 700 plus years, God was patient with these people. And when the time was right, when it was the righteous and just time to deal with the wickedness in that part of the world, God brought the Israelites in and used them as his instruments of justice. And we see that explicitly in Genesis 15:16. God speaking to Abraham, and he says this, "In the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure." That's something, isn't it? Hundreds of years before, when God is making this promise that he knew he would fulfill, beginning on this day when they took Jericho, but only when it was when his justice, his righteous justice would be served. And it tells us something important, that God does deal with the evil and wickedness in the world. He sees it. He's more patient than any of us would be. But in his righteousness, he does deal with the evil and wickedness in the world. So the other side of this story is the justice that God brought on the Canaanites and all the nations of the land, the inhabitants of Jericho and the other cities there. And where we tend to struggle with this is we don't know that side of the story. Like, there's no section of the Bible that tells us all about their wickedness and all about their evil that led to this moment specifically. But God does know, and God sees the other side of the story. And so when we get troubled about God's justice and we just wonder about what he's doing, we can rest in his justice, even if we don't know the whole story. So God is just in what he's doing. And also the city of Jericho became a first fruits offering, entirely sacrificed to God. This was the first city they conquered, and it wasn't this way in every city. The rules were a little bit different that God gave to the Israelites in each of the cities, but this first one was unique in that it was utterly sacrificed to the Lord. Just like the Israelites would bring their first and best from their flocks as a sacrifice to the Lord. It was an act of worship, reminding us that this whole battle was an act of worship of God. But not only can we rest in God's justice, we also see in the conclusion of the story that we can rest in God's mercy. So one of those Jerichoans was a prostitute named Rahab, and she stepped out in courage and faith, and she hid these spies, was used by God for his purposes. And then what we learn later on is she became an ancestor of Jesus himself. She became part of the lineage of Jesus and is included in the genealogies of the New Testament as in the family line of the Messiah. She's commended in the book of Hebrews for her faith. God had mercy on her and her family, plucking her out and saving her. And that's good news for you and me, because of all the characters in this story, the one that we can relate to the most is Rahab. You and I are the sinners outside of God's people. The gospel is that he loved you enough to show mercy to you, to offer you salvation, like he offered it to Rahab. And so the invitation for us, among all of the lessons of this story, believing God's promises even when they take a long time, trusting God's plans even when they seem strange, resting in God's justice and mercy even when we don't know the story, the whole story. You and I can be strong and courageous, knowing that the Lord will be with us wherever we go because of his mercy through the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's how we enter into all of these promises. And this is what we take with us from story number 10 of the top 10 Bible stories for a life of faith. Don't miss next week. It's going to be number 9. Would you join me in prayer? Lord, thank you for this story that teaches us how to have faith in you, that shows us your promises and your faithfulness to keep those promises, even when from our perspective, they could take a really, really long time. So help us, Lord, as we wrestle with this in our own lives. Give us the patience, give us the faith, give us the courage and strength to believe you. Give us the courage and strength to trust in your plan. When things in our lives are happening that just don't make sense to us, Lord, help us to trust in you and what you are doing. If it's not good, then you're not done. Lord, help us to rest in your justice and in your mercy, even when we don't know the whole story. Lord, draw us to you, and we'll give you thanks and praise in Jesus' name. Amen.